This is Eugene Chan and welcome to Straight Talk. Our guest tonight is Professor Linga Kan. He was the Director of Planning and formerly the Strategic Planning Advisor for the Hong Kong Shenzhen Corporation of the Hong Kong SAR government. He has served in the planning department for more than 30 years, handling numerous planning studies and development projects. Tonight, we have invited Professor Ling to tell us if he thinks getting rid of red tape and bureaucracy will fix Hong Kong's housing crisis. Welcome, KK.
Welcome.
Right, as you know, our Chief Executive candidate, Mr. John Lee, presented his manifesto last Friday, and one of his 4 tenets of vision is that to streamline procedures, providing more housing and better living. So housing is definitely high on his agenda. Mr. Eric Ma, our formerly Secretary for Development, was here last week, and he said that to solve our housing shortage, the government must get rid of the red tapes and release more land. So KK, you have been a key person because you have been with the government for the last few decades in the planning department, looking at Hong Kong's land, and etc. So you would be the best person to tell our viewers, do you agree that by removing so-called red tape will fix Hong Kong's imminent housing crisis?
The statement of removing red tapes is always right.
Right.
But the point is, what are these red tapes? We know that land development is a very complicated process, and it involves several very important ordinances, and they all have statutory requirement to meet, various purpose. So I think we have to find out more carefully what procedures is now considered excessive and can be streamlined.
Right, KK, maybe before we go into more details of what we are referring to, red tapes or regulations or consultations, I know the last few years in Hong Kong we have like 29,000 units of both public and private housing, and it has been said that it's not enough. So how many more units do we have to provide per year that will meet our current demand?
The long-term housing strategy is talking about will lead to provide almost 46,000 units a year.
Right.
All right. So I think that is more or less. There may be fluctuations, but more or less that is the amount.
Right. So as you know, we all understand that having not enough land, therefore not enough housing for Hong Kong, has always been much talked about in the community. Being a real professional in the area, is land supply the only issue that affects the number of units we have for public and private housing?
I won't say that's the only factor, but that is a very, very important factor, very critical factor, I would say. If we cannot produce sufficient amount of developable land, then you just cannot erect buildings.
Right. So
provision of sufficient development land is a critical issue.
Right. What other issues will be sort of affecting the number of housing units being built?
Then that comes to if a development land is provided, then how efficient we will be able, to lay the infrastructure, build the housings. Then that's another factor. Right.
So Mr. John Lee, in his manifesto, he said we must streamline the procedures and also compress the housing construction process. Is exactly what you're saying. So just for the viewers' information, how long does it take from a piece of land, right from say it's available, to when it's ready to have a unit that people can actually move in or use? How long is the process?
Well, it really depends on the situation. If we are talking about a greenfield site, it means that we need to, there's nothing there except, for example, trees and wildlife, all right? Then if we have to turn this into a development land, then probably, first of all, we need to carry out very detailed planning and engineering feasibility study, as well as environmental impact assessment.
Right.
With that, then we can set down the layout for the infrastructure, how the roads will go, all right, how the water supply, sewage discharge, how this can be handled, what sort of land uses. For example, not only housing, we need schools, we need park, all right, we need various sorts of community services, how this should be allocated in this area, then probably this sort of study normally will take about 30 months.
Right.
All right, that's the normal schedule. And of course, during that period, we carry out a lot of ground investigation, design investigation, and also engage, the stakeholders. Mm-hmm. And after that, then we need to go through a number of statutory requirements under for example, the town planning ordinance, the roads ordinance, all right, the land. If private land is involved, then we need to go through the land resumption ordinance to resume, the private properties in order to consolidate the ownership of the land.
Right.
And if there are some people living there or some business living there, then we also need to, rehouse the people, clear the business operation. Only when these are completed, then the piece of land is clean, and then, we can start with what we call the earth moving. Right. Activities to form the land.
Actually, it takes you a few minutes to explain to us the number of ordinances they have to go through. No wonder it takes time. I read in one report that there was an application for redevelopment. They said they take them 6 years for it to be approved and take 4 to 5 years to build something on it. It becomes a 10 years process. So this is not unheard of before, right? It can be quite long.
It can be quite long, and actually it really depends on circumstances.
Right.
Sometimes if we talk about private property, there's one more complication. The developer, particularly in the new territories, the land ownership is so fragmented. Right. A private developer may not be easily, assemble all the land holding to form an integrated site. So there may be holes there. Right. So you still need to negotiate with some other property owners, and that takes time.
Right. So as both Mr. John Lee has proposed and also Mr. Eric Ma has said to remove the red tape. But so as you said earlier, we had not defined what are the red tapes. They must be there for a reason. So why are we having all these so-called due process put in the system? What is the purpose?
I think the purpose is, first of all, we need to make sure that the environment is not unduly affected. All right, so we always need to strike a proper balance between development and conservation. All right, so that's the first part. And the other part is we need to ensure, the private interest is also fairly taken care of. All right, so if the development affect somebody's interest, then we need to, handle it carefully, right, under the law.
Say if there are no red tapes, if we remove them once and for all, what will be the side effects? Would it be a lot of traffic congestion? There may be light pollution, etc.
As I said, depends on how you define red tapes. All right, red tapes you may define as some sort of excessive procedure and regulations. Mm-hmm. But so far, all these regulations and procedures or considerations are relevant and necessary. Right. I think the point is how we can do this quicker, and how we can better integrate all this process instead of doing consequentially, completing A and then B and then C. Can A, B, C to a certain extent overlap with each other, so we can compress the process.
So this is what I meant by the streamlining the procedure.
Yes,
so the red tape should be there, but it has to be more streamlined. And also, since you mentioned more integration, I know right at this moment, this government has 2 bureaus, one for the planning, one is for the housing. They're separate. So in the new proposal by Mrs. Carrie Lam and last year, he said some of the work has to be merged together to be more efficient. Do you agree, being a person being there for decades?
I think some sort of division of responsibility is necessary. All right. So we need to be very clear who is responsible for what.
Right.
All right. However, it doesn't mean that I'm only doing my job without taking into account what other people are doing. So it would be more efficient if all these departments responsible for a particular project can go together, and then resolve the problems together.
Right.
Then that will be more efficient.
KK, you have been a civil servant for your career, and you have rise through to being a director. And recently there have been a lot of discussion on civil servants' efficiency. And I mean, I know many civil servants, and I mean, you just can't say one opinion for all. So but it is true, like Eric Ma said last week, there is a blame culture in Hong Kong in the last few years, especially the citizens will blame the civil servants for whatever they don't like, and so the civil servants become very protective in nature. Firstly, is that true? And secondly, with Mr. John Lee proposing bring a us and we attitude with the civil servants, they may even put in KPIs and all that. Do you think that is a new way forward?
Well, first of all, about the bring culture, I think, yeah, it is true that, you know, the civil servant receive a lot of complaints almost every day. Mm-hmm. And to a certain extent, we are pretty used to it. We have to look at all these complaints, whether these complaints are reasonable or sometimes to some extent not entirely reasonable. Mm-hmm. But in any case, all these complaints reflect the concern of the people. And then we need to consider them and we need to respond to it. So to a certain extent, I would say, yes, this so-called bring culture make the civil servants work more cautiously. And sometimes they may stop for a while and look at all these complaints. Why suddenly there are so many complaints? Right. All right, so that is inevitable. But I can never find out any government in the world would not receive complaints. All right.
Right. All right. Okay. Let's have a break, and when we'll come back, we'll go back to this area again. We have Professor Ling Gia-Kim with us tonight, and we have been talking about getting rid of red tape and bureaucracy to fix Hong Kong's housing crisis. So KK, in the first part, we had a quick look at, we both agree that land is needed for the development, and we look at some of the red tape then is necessary, but maybe we can streamline better. The last area we touched on is the civil servants being in the community headlines nowadays, saying that they can work better, and you were saying that all government will receive complaints and you will handle it accordingly. Recently, in the Hong Kong Foundation report, they were saying that to cut the red tape is to drive the civil servants' performance to the fullest. And in South Korea and Singapore, they even give incentives to promotion or even cash bonuses. Do you think our civil servants need that to work harder, or they're already working very hard?
I think the civil servants, in my experience, are working very hard. I'm not sure whether this sort of a so-called cash bonus, you know, will add to the further efficiency of the whole civil servant.
Right. One question is, when you're saying having KPI, key performing index, that means more data has to be collected. Does that mean more bureaucracy created?
Well, KPIs are useful, right? At least we know our target, and then if ongoing monitoring the situation. KPIs are useful. Of course, how we generate KPIs, are these KPIs at the very start, you know, pragmatic for achieving or anything else, then I think that's always the problem.
Yeah, that's why I'm worried it becomes more bureaucratic, having more KPIs. Anyway, let's move on to another area. You've been with the government for decades, and I read in the 2019 with the government planning department report, is saying that 42% of the land is used for country park.
Yes.
25% is for development, and only 7% is for housing. Is there any way that we can free up more land so that the 7% of the land, that amount will go up?
Of course, we can do it. Actually, we are doing it. In the early several years ago, government carried out a very so-called big debate about the methods in supplying the land. All right, and then it comes up to top priority. Supported, or two top preference supported by the people. One is the large-scale conversion of brownfield sites.
Right.
All right. So that is when we talk about large-scale conversion of brownfield sites. Then actually we are talking about new town approach, comprehensive planning and development approach. The second preference is, large scale reclamation outside of Victoria Harbour, and that's our Land Out Tomorrow or Central Harbour's reclamation. So with these projects, press ahead, then certainly will increase, the percentage of residential land.
That will increase eventually.
Yeah. Yes, definitely.
But KK, I'm sure the viewers and me were going to ask you the next question. Naturally, is Hong Kong has always known to be not have a lot of land, but we've got some beautiful country parks. Housing prices or the housing condition has never been that ideal because we're not living in very big houses. Sometimes the flats are quite congested together. And every chief executive after the handover has been saying that we must fix the housing.
Yes.
Every chief executive. And I'm sure they're putting very good policies. Being there for the last decades, what was the reason that after all those efforts, we are still behind and we're still not enough land? I'm sure many people want to know.
Actually, I always said that we lost 20 years' time.
Right.
The first 10 years, it was because of the Asian financial crisis, and then the government stopped the land formation process. Right. So to a certain extent, that respond to the demand of the community. There are confidence crisis about the property price, this and that. All right. So we essentially stopped all the land formation process in the first 10 years after the return. All right. And then when we trigger again the development process, which was in 2007, when the then chief executive, Mr. Donald Tsang, declared the 10 major infrastructure projects, then we encounter a large number of, I would say, political objections.
Right.
All right. So from some sectors of the public, even legislative council. Also, essentially, we need to chase up. We need to chase up. Mm-hmm. So I think we are now getting into the momentum. The momentum already triggered. Mm-hmm. So we have a number of what we call the new development areas in Kutong Loft, Fanning Loft, Hong Shui Kiu development trigger. So if nowadays you go to Hong Shui Kiu area, you can see all the cranes are moving in the skyline. So a lot of construction activities are being actively taken.
So you're saying that because of various factors, we were delayed.
Yes.
And now with the momentum and with determination, as Mr. John Lee has proposed, we have a chance of at least catching up in the right direction.
Yes, that's my view.
Right. I want to ask you, Land Out Tomorrow, as you said, reclamation is one thing that people have been talking about in the last decades. But Mrs. Lam was proposed in 2018. There was actually, I'll check back some record. There was a study on reclaiming the land was started like 8 years ago, even 2014. Up until today, it hasn't really started. And someone say it's because too much public engagement and too much research. Do you agree?
No, I don't agree. As far as I know, the government said that, the preliminary engineering and land use plan for Land Out Tomorrow will be announced later this year for public engagement. And when you talk about whether public engagement is a hurdle, to development process, the answer is yes and no. Well, first of all, we cannot do away with a public engagement because we really need to, get the opinion of the stakeholders and whether they will support it. And after all, the development project will need to go to the Legislative Council to ask for public money to implement, and then the Legislative Councillors will definitely, concerned about whether the community is supportive.
So with the new initiative, the Northern Metropolis, is it going to take another 10 years, do you think?
Well,
you still have public engagements, you have to get the money.
Actually, the Northern Metropolis is not something come out of a scratch. Right. There are 3 new towns already there, a number of new development areas which are in fact expansion of the current new towns. Mm-hmm. Right? Study completed, works being taken at various stages, and the Northern Metropolis development strategy is proposed, to add more development land, mm-hmm. and then make it provide more jobs, and then work out a spatial framework, so that we can be more integrated with the development assumption to make use of the energy, development energy for our benefit.
Right.
All right.
So, yes, KK, for both the Atlanta tomorrow and also the Northern Metropolis, there are long-term projects. Say for more short-term, I mean, like Mr. John Lee on his manifesto has already said he's going to review to 16,000 hectare of green belt zone as well as the 1,600 hectare of brownfield that you just mentioned. But there's also someone on the community bring up the fact that how about country park fringes? That was included. What is your view on that? Should we also have that as well?
We do not need to go into a country park, in my opinion. All right, we have 16,000 hectare of green belt site, which is outside country park. All right, so why didn't we, give further investigation about, which part of this green belt may be suitable for development? Actually, when I was a director, we identified about 150 hectare of green belt site, which is outside country park, and that will be able to accommodate about 90,000 flats. And actually, this sort of what we call the rezoning exercise is still ongoing. And for the brownfield site, actually, many of the new development areas and many of the proposed development land in the Lofton Metropolis, they will be formed by conversion of the brownfield site, because most of the brownfield site are actually concentrated in the Lofton Metropolis area.
Right. KK, one last question I'm going to ask you is about use of land. We talk about long term, we talk about short term, and we have enough say on the green belt zone. But then how about, recently I brought up a couple of times because a lot of viewers ask me, how about golf courses? Because Hong Kong, we don't have many golf courses. One of the thinking is take back some of the golf courses because for building houses. So if you're going to have all this land available, why do we have to affect sort of a sports development? Because what they're worried is, after the golf courses, they maybe go to football fields, they can go to swimming pools, etc. What is your view on that?
Of course, you're talking about the Fanning Golf Course, or part of it.
Part of it, yes.
I personally walked into the golf course several times, and I found that the ecology there is quite valuable. There are a number of very variable mature trees. Many of them are rare species, and there are a large number or a large concentration of insect grapes.
Okay.
That is some sort of our cultural heritage.
Okay.
So I think we have to be very careful when we move development into the golf course.
Right, okay, KK, so that's all the time we have. Time flies, and thank you for sharing your thoughts on how the new administration can streamline procedures so that we have more building and better living. And all of you, have a good week and see you next time.